one of the Resolve interdisciplinary seminar series, and even though Resolve comes gradually to the close of its core funding, we're going to keep these seminar series going because they're attracting a fantastic array of speakers from all sorts of different places, and they speak, I think, to a very useful interdisciplinary agenda around sustainability. And in that spirit, it's a great pleasure to welcome the new MSc students from CES just on their induction week this week, and also some more familiar faces from Resolve who have gone places. Neve somewhere I saw coming in, good to see you. And a great pleasure too to welcome Chris Tuppen to give this talk. Sometimes when we're introducing speakers, it's difficult to summarise the institutional background, because a lot of academics move from one institution to another. Chris has been resolutely for 32 years an employee, resolutely for 32 years an employee of BT. First as an engineer there, and then more latterly, in fact, I think it was the first environmental manager position in 1990, around about then, and his final position was Chief Sustainability Officer at BT. At a time, really, certainly in the early 1990s, when that kind of position was, if you were lucky, there at all in an institution, and quite often only a tokenistic place to be at the best of times. But Chris has enormous experience, in other words, in terms of working on sustainability issues inside business. He left last year to pursue some freelance things. He's working with the Prince of Wales Accounting for Sustainability Programme, for example, and with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Both of those initiatives, I think, are doing really interesting things with and for business, and so that particular business perspective is something that Chris brings in spades. And I'd also kind of like to extend a personal thanks to Chris, because when Prosperity Without Growth was first published, certainly as a report, it didn't have that many fans, and Chris, even though he was inside a business community, was one of the people prepared to get up openly and say this was an important discussion to have. So thanks, Chris, for that. And we welcome you and invite you to talk to us about smart cities and smart people.
Great. Thanks very much, Tim. Actually, my life is on the wall in many ways, because when I first started at BT, this is what I did. I used ultra-high vacuum systems to produce semiconductors that became the lasers that now shine the light down the fibre optics. And so I went from this and into information and communication technologies, and then into sustainability. So very nice of you to put my life history on the wall there. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to talk principally around smart city technologies. This is the application of information and communication technologies to address the carbon footprint of cities. By all means, sort of interrupt and ask questions as we go through, or we go through and then have an opportunity at the end to ask questions. So, I've got a bit of background to start with. I'm sure some of you will know some of this background, but just to sort of kick things off, really, why cities? Why are cities important? Well, more people today live in cities than in the rural environment for the first time ever, and that trend is only going to increase. And if you just work out the numbers of the number of new urban city dwellers there will be between now and 2030, 2050, it's equivalent to building the city of London every 40 to 45 days around the world. So, not in this country, but in countries like China, there is just an explosion of urban development taking place at this kind of scale. So, cities are absolutely crucial in terms of meeting the carbon reduction targets that need to take place. And why smart? This graph here is taken from the IEA Energy Technology Perspectives. International Energy Agency, they publish every year an evaluation of energy and carbon emission trends. This is the total CO2 from fossil fuels emitted worldwide every year. And this is the business as usual projection, and they work out the least cost route to achieving the 450 parts per million CO2 concentration in the atmosphere by 2050, which is projected to cap temperature rise at 2 degrees centigrade. So this is where we're heading, and this is what we need to be on. And then they look at the various technologies that are available to achieve that. And so things like renewables, you can see in green there, carbon capture and storage, nuclear. And often in the sort of climate change debate, it's those that get most of the attention. But actually, what's crucial is that in order to achieve this pathway, the IEA reckon that nearly 50% must come from energy efficiency. And the European Union and others are now sort of scratching their head as to say, how are we going to achieve those energy efficiency gains? Because the history and the record is not great around energy efficiency. And it's in that space that these smart technologies play. So Europe has got 2020 targets, 20% reduction in CO2 against 1990 levels, we're on target. 20% of energy from renewables by 2020, we're pretty much on target for that. 20% of energy efficiency, we're not on target. Only about halfway in terms of achieving that. And this is why the European Commission is looking at ways to really drive energy efficiency forward, and they are looking at smart cities as a key component of delivering that energy efficiency objective here. So at the moment, the Commission is bringing out a lot of the new research programme funding and orientating it around smart cities. There's billions of euros available to cities over the next 5 years to demonstrate smart city technology and application. China is not sitting on its backside. China has also got very aggressive carbon reduction targets, albeit intensity targets, and they're also driving energy efficiency very hard. This is the latest 5-year plan from China, and the thing with China is that when they put something in their 5-year plan, they more or less guarantee that it's going to be delivered. It's not the case for UK targets and so on. So I believe that China is looking at a lot of these new technologies, driving in their own home domestic market, and then looking to sell this around the world as part of the next sort of economic development and mass marketplace for the products that, and services developed in China. And this is based on the UK, and this is the UK's carbon footprint for fossil fuel emissions. So I've taken out agricultural emissions out of this, and the Climate Change Act requires the UK government to achieve an 80% reduction on CO2 emissions by 2050. So we know that that's the height of the carbon footprint for the UK in 2050. You say, well, okay, so what am I going to allocate to that carbon footprint there? And essentially, it's going to be really difficult to reduce aviation and shipping emissions. There's also a number of sort of traditional industrial processes that it's going to be incredibly difficult to decarbonise. So when you put those two together, that absorbs that carbon allowance, which means everything else by 2050 needs to be decarbonised. And this is typical for any developed world economy. So surface transport, lorries, cars, trains, anything within the domestic scene, completely decarbonised. A lot of industry will have to be decarbonised. Heating, heating our homes, decarbonised. Equally, heating pretty much all commercial buildings, completely decarbonised. And the power sector, electricity generation, will also be completely decarbonised. So this is a massive transformation of the economy that's going to take place over the next 40 years. And within that context, again, sits this combination of technologies to deliver low carbon energy plus the energy efficiency challenge. So I'm now going to switch into sort of looking at these challenges from a city perspective, and particularly look at power generation, built infrastructure, transportation, and data systems. And look, first of all, at the sort of trends and drivers that are moving us towards the application of ICT to address climate change and the sort of economic and energy backdrop to it. So starting off with the power. So I've also created my own sort of meter here, which I call a linometer. So the extent to which these things are in alignment, because once these things are all in alignment, hopefully the market economy will create the products and services to drive it forward, and it will just happen as a sort of natural matter of course. So for each one of those, this is my own personal interpretation of how extensively they are aligned. So you'll see an alinometer reading for each of those. So if we start off with electricity generation in the power sector. Of course, we've got the whole issue of peak oil and gas reserves running out. We've got not only the population growth, but the massive increase in middle-class consumers in the emerging economies who will adopt the kind of lifestyles that we are used to in the Western world. And it's expected to be around a billion more middle-class consumers over the next 15, 20 years. So that is going to drive huge demand on electricity, just as the point where the fossil fuels are actually running out. And then on top of that, we've got the climate change agenda with those statutory targets that are in place increasingly across the world. There should be a carbon floor price graph on there. It seems to be, should be above here, but actually, so the UK has proposed to bring in a statutory carbon floor price for electricity, and it sort of goes up like this to about £50 a tonne, I think, by 2030. That's the proposal. So that will bring in another economic driver into decarbonisation of the electricity system. And then there is just a need in Europe and in the UK to replace a whole load of ageing infrastructure around power generation. In Europe, it's projected €1 trillion money will need to be spent on upgrading the European power generation and network infrastructure over the next decade. So when you bring all of these things together, it's more or less guaranteed that the smart grid, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, is inevitable. And therefore, my alinometer on power generation is in the green. Let me quickly explain what a smart grid is. So this is a typical sort of building. We've got electricity generation goes into the local distribution network. So in our house, people come around maybe once a year, if we're lucky, once every 2 years to read the meter. That's all the electricity company knows about what's happening in our house at any point in time, once every 2 years. So if there was intelligence in the local distribution network, you could drive all sorts of efficiencies into there. And if you're interested about how that works, you can talk about that later. Then, where the power enters the home, we have a smart meter. Now, the government in the UK is mandating the introduction of smart meters. So all homes will have smart electricity and gas meters by 2020 in the UK, at the latest. The smart meter allows electricity companies to interrogate at any time what the consumption is for the house. We're getting more and more distributed renewables, and the odd house with PV on is fine, but if you had a whole street of houses with PV on, the current network would not work properly. If there was a really sunny day like at the moment, the likelihood is that there would be over voltage. The voltage on the local network would exceed the statutory limits, and therefore cities and looking to put this kind of out at scale have to have a smart grid in place in order to cope with the variations and fluctuations in voltage that take place. As we get more and more renewables on the system, then we're going to see a lot more fluctuation in the supply of electricity. So at the moment, with big power stations, the fluctuations are mostly in demand, and the supply meets and varies according to the demand. In the future, we'll have both demand and supply varying. So somehow, we need to balance the grid to make sure it all matches up. And one way that we can do that is by actually having real-time demand management. So this here is an air conditioning unit made by a company in California. And what it does is it freezes water, generally overnight, when there's a surplus of electricity. And then during the day, if there's a shortage of electricity, then it can take all the air conditioning, refrigeration air conditioning load off the grid and use the cold that it's stored overnight to keep the building comfortable during the day. Similarly, your washing machine might be online and will heat up and so on according to the surplus availability of electricity. So you can imagine all sorts of devices that are sitting on the grid that, in response to signals coming in from the electricity company, will vary the demand and load it's taking off the grid in response. Decarbonisation of transport will require it's either hydrogen or it's electric. And most people seem to be putting their money on electric at the moment, especially for sort of cars. That's going to put a huge load on the grid. You can imagine everyone driving home at the end of the day, getting home at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening, not only putting their cookers on and having kettles, but plugging their cars in. There's going to be a huge demand. So again, it needs some kind of balancing to match that out. And another thought is that with a country full of electric cars, there's going to be a massive storage of electricity in all those batteries, so you might have an agreement with the electricity company that they can take 5–10% out of here if they deliver you cheaper electricity. So it acts as part of that grid balancing system. Then there's the information that this smart meter can provide in the home, into buildings and so on, and that information hopefully encourages behaviour change. Then if you've got a whole estate of typical buildings, you might have a centralised energy management system where you've got all this data coming in to help you optimise the energy consumption of your estate. So large companies like BT that had thousands of buildings are putting this kind of technology in place now. And a BT home worker sits at home and can access all the smart meters around the BT estate now and can pick out sort of abnormalities in terms of consumption and then send an engineer out to have a look, see what's going on. So that takes us into buildings. We know energy costs are going up. The European Commission, seeing the fact that we're not meeting the energy targets, have produced a draft energy efficiency directive, and that is bringing in regulations that will drive energy efficiency within buildings. And they're putting a lot of pressure on the public sector, actually. And that partly leads to smart buildings, and then, as we've just been seeing, can't really separate a smart grid out from smart buildings. And it's all part of one of the same ecosystem. And therefore, if we see the smart grid as essential, we're kind of moving into smart buildings as well. So my lineometer there is not quite as aligned, and my sense is that we'll see a lot more activity in the large built infrastructure before we do in homes around smart technologies. It's a lot easier to do at a bigger scale in commercial buildings than it is to start thinking about residential buildings. And I think the statistic is that 80% of all the built infrastructure in the UK and generally in Europe in 2050, 80% is already built. So the challenge is not in new builds so much, but it's in retrofit. Transport. Urbanisation is going to be one of the factors behind transport. Driving congestion. this picture's from the BBC website. It was the trial transport-free day in Beijing in the run-up to the Olympics. Not so successful. Peak oil, obviously affecting transport as well. Decarbonisation agenda, all leading us towards thinking around addressing these issues, again, the extent to which one might use smart technologies. In my sense, even less alignment here, but let's just have a look at some of the things that can be done. At the beginning of the year, I was asked by Bristol City Council to look at how smart technologies could help Bristol reduce its carbon footprint and meet its carbon objectives. This is Bristol's traffic control centre. They've got all sorts of sensors in the road, they control traffic lights to optimise traffic flow and so on. One thing that's happening in San Francisco is that they're trialling real-time parking charges that vary according to the amount of traffic and congestion there is in San Francisco. So I suggest that maybe in Bristol, as you drive into the city, not only do you sort of see how many spaces there are in the car parks, but you have something here that says what the parking charges are. And so if it's congested, there's a lot of traffic there, you'd get high parking charges, so you know that before you set off, and therefore you might sort of deviate into the park and ride rather than go into Bristol and have an expensive car. Mobility on demand. In London we have Boris's bikes, which is effectively mobility on demand. So on the smartphone you can see whether there's bike availabilities, where you can drop the bike off. Smartphone apps, I have to say I've tried that. The smartphone app on my phone never works. It always lies about how many bikes there are available. But ultimately we will hopefully get there. A lot of cities have got city car clubs now, so you don't own a car. You can just look up, see where there's a car available, and you can go up and sort of use that car and drop it off. This minibus here is in Genoa, and this is demand-responsive transport, public transport. And the idea here is that it's between a taxi and a bus. So rather than having buses that come at set times on set routes, you can say on your smartphone, I'm in Guildford University, I want to get to the bus station, and it will look up on the system to see where the minibuses are. It will direct a minibus to you where you are, pick you up, might pick up a couple of other people and drop people off on your way, but then drop you off in a short period of time at where you need to go. So this is actually working at a trial level in Genoa. Helsinki are also sort of experimenting with this demand-responsive public transport. Real-time information, we're very used to that. You have the signs on the bus stops here telling you when the next bus is coming along. I think we're just getting more and more of that kind of thing. Integrated logistics. This, again, is in Bristol. It was a trial funded by the European Commission. It's a freight consolidation scheme. So rather than all the lorries bringing deliveries to the shops into the centre of Bristol all coming in, they go to the outskirts of Bristol, and the loads are consolidated into a small number of vehicles that then drive in and deliver the goods. And then there's travel substitution in terms of actually avoiding the need to travel at all through teleconferencing, home working and teleworking. So that's the sort of spread of ICT technologies around transport. And finally, looking at actual data systems. So this is from Cisco. It's a report they term the Internet of Things. Often you'll hear people talk about machine-to-machine interfaces. So this is machines talking to machines, rather like some of those smart grid examples. In about 2008, there were more internet-connected devices in the world than there are people in the world. And according to Cisco, by 2020, there ought to be about 50 billion internet-connected devices around the world. That is going to create a huge mass of data and information. So what can we do with that data? Now you can imagine all these sort of applications, smart grid. Within these circles, the idea will be to use that data to optimize that system. So when you use your Oyster card, for example, that's a smart bit of data that sits and helps optimize London transport. So imagine if all these data flows could be consolidated together, and you could then apply the data to help optimize not the individual bits of the system, but the system as a whole. So one could envisage like a real-time city-wide dashboard. So the mayor on their desk would be able to look on their computer and see what was going on in real time around energy flows, people flows, traffic flows. Once this is consolidated and anonymized, then and made available, apps creators will create apps. You get them on your smartphones, and then your smartphone itself will know where it is and can be a source of information and feedback into the data platform. Very early days on all of this at the moment, but people are beginning to think about it. And this is Rio de Janeiro, where IBM and Cisco have helped put together this kind of city dashboard. And they look at transport, water, weather, energy, and all that information is beginning to come together. And cloud computing and what's called web services, which are increasingly taking place now in enterprise computing platforms, are very well placed to help this happen. So why doesn't all this happen anyway, then? Well, first of all, a lot of people who work in things like transport departments only ever really think about moving things and transporting things in the traditional way. So they haven't really been trained to think about these new applications. Also within city councils, it often means people in different departments talking to each other and working together, which they've never done in the past. So it's very difficult to get real hard data around the business case. If you're going to prove this at a commercial level, there's very little information available to do that. Retrofit's a real issue, particularly around buildings. And if this is all going to work together and all these devices are going to talk to each other and so on, there's a critical need for standards within the industry to allow that to happen. And those standards aren't really there at the moment. Even with electric cars, they can't agree on what the plug should be on electric cars. So if you can't agree on electric plugs, you know, what hope have we got for this? But technology or people. So some people say, you know, this is not about technology at the end of the day, it's all around behaviour change. For me, it's not such a sort of polarised thing, it's around both. You know, it's around some things can happen behind the scenes and can be fully automated. And some things absolutely need people to engage in to make it happen. So one of the pictures on that smart buildings slide was a mock-up of a building which had like a screen on the outside of the building. And from a distance, that screen is either red, amber or green. And that tells you how well that building is doing in achieving its energy efficiency objectives. And as you walk towards it, you actually see the more detailed data on the screen. Now, if that was sort of put in place around cities, you could imagine that people would start comparing buildings, and why is this one red? And why hasn't that one got a smart screen on the outside of the building? So, behaviour change and technology. But some things, I think, will just be purely automated and will take place behind the scenes. This is a recent announcement by a company called Pegasus that are based in Washington. And they're going to build a 52 square kilometre model smart city in New Mexico that is being used to test this. The thing is, no one's going to live there. So how you can test smart technologies without actually having people, because we all know that computers will work fine and do things perfectly in a sort of perfect setup. But as soon as you bring in the real world of real people, then I'm not convinced that that's going to be terribly helpful. Just to finish off, to sort of bring this into the sort of a little bit of practical reality, if you like. This is our house at home. So one of my hobbies is just sort of playing around with smart technologies to see if we can make the house smart. And with apologies to my daughter who's in the audience, as an invasion of the family's privacy. Let's have a look at what this is showing us. So this is the temperature of the hot water tank, and you can see it plummets there at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's a teenager, this is my son, not my daughter. So they use most of the hot water tank to have a shower, and it's sort of midday, it's just gone up. Fortunately, it was a warm afternoon, the sun was out, and the solar thermal panels on the roof heated up the hot water in the hot water tank. So you can see the sun heating up the hot water in the hot water tank. So this is the electricity consumption for the house for 24 hours. And that spike is a kettle coming on there. Anyone have any ideas what this little lot here is? All that power being consumed? Central heating? No. No. Gas central heating, sorry. Television? No. Televisions would be about down here, and they're not that energy intensive. It's the oven. The oven's on. So this is the oven heating up to start with, and then this is the thermostat coming in and out to keep the oven right temperature. And that was baking a cake. So it's a fruit cake, so it was on quite a long time. So in terms of behaviour change, you know, once we saw this, we hadn't really thought about, you know, the amount of power that's being used to bake a cake before. So now what we do is make sure that we use the oven for more than one thing when we're doing stuff. Now there's a couple of kettles going on here. Television was probably on here with lights going into the evening, and then it's down here, just gone 1 o'clock in the morning. Even though I didn't look at this until the following day, we knew what time our son went to bed that night. Now we've got PV on the roof as well, so this looks a bit more complicated with the PV generation. But just some of the sort of things to consider around the sort of technology social interface. So I've invaded our family's privacy by sharing that with you. The Netherlands have recently suspended, or earlier in the year, they suspended rollout of their smart meters because people were concerned that if they got hacked into, thieves could tell whether they were on holiday or not, simply from the sort of pattern of consumption of the house from smart meters. So security and privacy issues are really important. Similarly, businesses are concerned around commercial confidentiality. So they don't want people to be able to remotely see how much power they're consuming in their premises, for example. The more and more we put this technology in and things become automated, you can imagine a sort of cyber attack or a virus getting into a smart grid and the whole lot kind of falling over. So resilience of the infrastructure is going to be really critical. A lot of these things work better if there are monopolies of provision. So in the UK, our electricity system is very, very deregulated, as you know. So you've got generators, you've got the grid, you've got the local network distributing companies. You can buy your electricity off of a completely different company to the electricity distributing company. And it's a lot easier to put some of the technology in if it's all one big vertically integrated monopoly. So how do we make sure that we get the benefits of the technology and the benefits of competition and consumer protection? People will want to keep the data to themselves and not share it. So that's sort of data consolidation platform I talked about. We need open access data. We need to take account of these things, so anonymise the data stream so people don't know where it's come from, and then make it open source and open access. And equally have open standards so that people can make use of that data, load of protocols, create the apps and so on. And then finally, make sure that we don't hit the rebound. So if we improve traffic flows through a city using all this smart technology, is that equivalent to just building a new road so that we can cram more vehicles on those roads? There is a lot of possibility that these technologies will open up the increased consumption rather than reduction. So that's a quick rattle through for you. Thank you very much.
Great, Chris. I forgot to mention that it makes parenting much more difficult when you can't berate teenagers for getting up at midday. And it turns out it's exactly the right time for them to get up, so there's soda water.
Yeah, or even later.
Oh, yeah, later. Get up later. Okay, we've got a bit of time for questions.
In your talk, it was a fascinating talk, you didn't mention money or cost or where the money's coming from in, for instance, the UK, which is having a flatlining economy and already has a huge debt. I wondered if you've got any thoughts on that, or whether any other people have thought about it.
Well, partly that's why the government's introducing the carbon floor price to create some of the money flows that will deliver the investment. There's the green bank that the UK is bringing in. I think it's £200 billion is required on the UK power infrastructure by 2020, and at the moment none of those are going to provide anywhere near enough funding.
Part of that question,
yeah.
flowing on from the point about investment in electricity supply, I think most people think only about 22% is going to come from renewables,
yeah.
and oil and gas, as you suggested, although gas has suddenly killed a new lease of life, I believe. Oil and gas are going downhill all the time. Where is the extra electricity coming from to operate all the cars and all the other equipment?
Well, it's the combination of that IEA chart,
yeah.
Of course. So it's the nuclear. But we're unlikely to build that fast enough.
Yeah.
And energy efficiency, so generating a megawatt, as Les Brown would say, is better than generating a megawatt of wind power. So but I was also going to mention that the smart buildings and building refurbishment. Most at a commercial level. Most companies will look for a payback of 2 to 3 years on energy efficiency in their buildings. That means that they want to get all their investment back in 2 to 3 years. If it doesn't meet that, they won't invest. And that's a real hurdle that's in place. And another sort of model that people are looking at are energy services companies. So rather than buying your electricity, you pay the electricity provider to keep your building warm and supplied and lit. So the capital cost goes to the provider rather than to the user of the building. And but there are accounting problems that I've discussed with Tim before about making that happen. So it is a real challenge about where the money is going to come from. But to keep the lights on, it's got to come from somewhere on the grid.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's very interesting talk. One point you made about privacy, I think, is going to be a major issue for smart meters.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Privacy is going to be a major issue.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering to what extent privacy in online banking, for example, security, IT security, is being drawn on to try and make people aware, perhaps, that we now have most of our banking details online, our medical details online, and so on. And these are challenges that have been met in the past. Could that knowledge be applied to smart technology as well?
I think it can be applied in two ways. One is in terms of getting the security of the information right. But I think the other way is also to think through why is it that we're comfortable with banks doing that and we'd be uncomfortable with smart meters. And I think the answer is that see privacy as a tradable right. So in other words, if I trade a bit of my privacy, what do I get in return? So with the banking, you get convenience. And I'm comfortable trading with convenience for a little bit of my privacy with an assurance of security underpinning it. And I think that will be the same with the smart meters. You know, if the only benefit of a smart meter is for the electricity company, then I'm going to be like this about it. But if I get something in return and I'm confident about the security that underpins it, then I'm going to be far less likely to sort of whinge about it.
I think it's nice to know that because just for the grounds for example, that
Yeah.
entire histories are provided.
Could I just ask you, I was sitting in a seminar here maybe about 6 months ago, and we had somebody from Whitehall telling us about government attitudes to power reduction. And I'm just wondering about how much political will there really is for this programme, because I remember he told us, to our surprise, that the phrase used was demand destruction, and it was considered almost unthinkable at that stage. Amongst politicians, I'm not talking here about technologists who work on this kind of thing. And obviously the reason for that is the reduced income to the power companies. It will be very, very difficult to put into practice. Do you have, has that changed a lot, or how do you see that issue? The political will to reduce demand and hence reduce income to power companies.
Well, I think it comes back a bit also to this sort of technology versus behaviour, sort of automation versus the behaviour change. And often the reason that the government has been reluctant to include that in its modelling is you can't be confident that it's going to happen. So, you know, replace coal-fired power stations with wind turbines, you know that. Hoping that people will change their behaviour and then stick to it is far less certain. So, the Climate Change Committee and DEC have not built that into their modelling as extensively. But also, I think, my sense, and I'm sure others might have a view, but my sense is that DEC is always very sort of compartmentalised as well. And they sort of come up with a sort of pet little bits of legislation, but very rarely sort of link it all together in a grander vision. And that this needs a grander vision, and you know, my sense is that Brussels and the Commission have much more of that vision in place than Whitehall.
But I mean, it wasn't a pessimism about individual demand reduction by people that drove it. It was simply the result of demand reduction, whether that was achieved by individuals being more careful in their consumption or due to automation and smart systems. The result would be the same, a reduce in the demand for power and lower revenues to the, and presumably lower growth. You know, that's the sort of bit harder pill to swallow, isn't it? The day.
It is, although if you're looking at the trajectories for electricity requirements going forward, once you build the decarbonisation will mean huge increases in electricity consumption for vehicles. But we go back to heating our homes extensively by electricity. You know, electricity powering ground source and air source heat pumps, and so on. So the actual projections for electricity, even with the efficiency built in, is still increasing. So I don't see why they really should be.
Okay, it's increasing overall.
Yeah. But there will be but it will be over the next 20 years. I think there is a sort of projection that it should come down and then go up again, which makes it difficult to plan electricity infrastructure as well.
Isn't part of the answer to that question getting the charging and the tariffs such that we're incentivised to use electricity at an appropriate time and actually reduce our consumption?
So there was an interesting trial in Washington where they varied the tariffs and looked to see how people varied their consumption as a result of it, and they actually had a variation, I think it was 5-fold in the price of electricity. and then they did actually see real patterns of consumption changing. It's a big variation, isn't it? Fivefold.
But that achieved total overall power use reduction while maintaining total expenditure? Or?
It was a small trial in a few houses, so I'm not sure. It would need to be scaled up
Yes.
to answer that.
On the data consolidator, you mentioned this consolidation of data and pools of data. I always saw that as being the real problem that's sort of holding back the technology. Do you have any views on how that would work? I mean, I'll give you an example. The mobile operators would not give you their data. And even if they did, to give you real-time data, you would want a stonking great big pipe into your system or your solution. So that then sort of negates the sort of business case for any kind of return in terms of a solution, a technical solution.
Well,
That's a fully loaded question. But,
well, people will be reluctant to open up the data. A few cities have got open data portals, and Paris, London have. So actually, you can go in and get public sector information coming in. But again, it comes back to the regulators a bit. So I asked them whether they had thought, as part of their smart meter rollout, to put in place the need, the requirement that data can be anonymised and then made available so cities can use it. And they hadn't really thought of that when I had the conversation with them earlier in the year. And so I guess there will be needs to be some kind of regulatory requirement that takes place. Otherwise, people will be very reluctant. I don't think the sort of bandwidth issues are a problem, really, because the amount of data, although 50 billion devices sounds a lot, the amount of data a smart meter generates is tiny, compared to probably like 2 minutes of iPlayer viewing on a house. It will give you the whole year's bandwidth for your smart meter, I suspect. It's tiny compared to what we look for.
Recently, I personally, as a citizen, have been involved with the consultative process with my local authority, which is not Guildford, about their local development plan with a vision for the year 2027, 15 years ahead. And every local authority in the country has been required by DEFRA to provide their vision. No mention of anything of this order whatsoever in the guidelines. And yet, on the other hand, to make your point about government department speaking to others, the Department of Energy and Climate Change is about to roll out their smart meter, they're in charge of the smart meter program, and also they're doing a Green Deal, which is coming out next year, which is a huge energy efficiency program for all 30 million buildings or something, 20 million buildings throughout the UK, which is mainly motivated by the need to provide more jobs, and I reckon that's going to produce a huge amount of work. It's quite a positive. It's all on the internet. We need to, students need to know about that sort of thing.
It's interesting. So I'm not surprised that they haven't really included it in the consultation. It's quite interesting in Bristol that they have consolidated their sustainability, their IT, and their economic development departments into one, which is called Bristol Future. So one director oversees those three areas, which is beginning to pull those things together.
Bristol's a city. Local authorities do have a disadvantage. They're not unitary. They can't pull all the strings.
Yeah. Well, even Bristol has a problem, because if you imagine Bristol as a circle, actually...
I know Bristol well, where my son lives, and he was in the IT business now.
All right, well, so you know that a third of it is actually in South Gloucestershire.
Yes, that's
so
right.
That traffic control centre only works over 2/3 of Bristol, because South Gloucestershire hasn't invested in that. So if you're up near Filton in a traffic jam, it's because the traffic control centre doesn't work.
Well, automatic control on how well it works. I need a test.
They can't even agree on
Are there more traffic jams in the park this morning?
Well, I've always been stuck in that kind of Bristol.
Okay, good. Thanks, Chris. Lots of opportunities there. Anyone who wants to know about car clubs, our new MSc students, there is one in Guildford. It's called Streetcar. It's now been bought up by Zipcar, and it costs £5.25 an hour, including fuel, which seems like a good way to avoid having a car if you're in Guildford. Not if you're in Farnham, where you have to travel 10.1 miles to get to the nearest car club. But certainly those kind of things work, and they do create and require different sorts of actions by people. I think Chris has made that point very well. I guess my one question, Chris, is are smart people the same as competent people? Are smart people the people you need to make smart technologies work, or are they actually, what happens in the event of system failure? Do you still have competence in the population to provide for themselves in the event of system failure?
I guess the trick with smart technology is to make it workable for everyone, isn't it? You know,
Yes.
so it's like the television remote control. How many of us really use the functionality of that? Most of the time, very few. So the human interface of it is crucial.
Good. Okay, that's very entertaining talk. Thank you very much for your time.